Hi, this is Adam Eliyahu Berkowitz from Israel 365 News. I have a very special guest. His name is Rick Winnecke. He's an artist. He's a Christian who's lived in Israel since 1977. And he recently put up an amazing installation outside of Auschwitz, I believe.
Outside of Auschwitz, Birkenau.
And Rick is personally an amazing guy. And his artwork, I have it on good authority. His artwork blows people away and touches them very deeply. So Rick, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself. A Christian living in Israel in 1977, it's not the usual story. So tell us a little bit about how you came to Israel and who you are.
Okay. First off, let me address the word Christian. All right. I came to Israel. I was a non-believer, totally focused on myself. I spent a lot of time doing drugs and just partying and everything while I was in Canada, and came to a point in Vancouver. I was a cab driver in Vancouver, stoned most of the time, and came to a point in my life where I felt like if something didn't drastically change, then I was either going to be dead or I was going to be in prison. For sure. It was the only two possibilities that I could see for myself then. In that time, I started to search outside of myself. I always believed there was a God, some kind of a creator artist out there. Nobody could ever convince me that everything that I see around me, especially things within nature, especially the change of leaves and the variety of colors that you would see consistently every year, was a result of an explosion 50 trillion years ago, more or less. And so I never bought that.
I can totally relate to that. It's like people ask me, do you believe in God? And I'm like, no, I know there's a God. I've seen it.
Yeah, it's past. Like his work is everywhere. But for me, my attitude at that point was, I think I always believed there was an artist out there for sure. And I loved his work. I just didn't want to know him. Because all the people that claimed an affiliation, say, with him were all, in my eyes, really strange and tight and not real. But within the situation I was in Vancouver, there was this place of desperation that always seems to push you outside of yourself. And I started to examine the possibility of really asking the question, is there really somebody there or not?
It's not usual that a non-Jew, I think most people at some point in their life start asking those questions, but it's not normal it's not the normal path for a non-Jew to ask those questions and end up in Israel.
Yeah, you might know better than me. It's like all I've got, in a sense, is my own experience, my own history, say. But for me, at that stage, you start to look outside, and it was pretty dramatic. I went out one night, looked up at the sky, and I just said, I want to give up all this garbage, or words to that effect. And really, in a sense, almost immediately within the next period of time, I had all these strange things starting to happen, like little circumstances that would get my attention and always cause me to think, is this him? How did this happen exactly? And so I was intrigued.
Where did the connection to Israel come in?
Well, the connection to Israel came in within the same period of time. I was living in a little apartment, pretty bad apartment, on the basement of a very old house downtown Vancouver. And everything people couldn't sell, the owners couldn't sell in yard sales, ended up in cardboard boxes in my space down in the basement. But there was boxes filled with books. and I hated reading with a passion. I would always claim to that point, never ever read a book. And it was something that I affiliated with being you severe loser for sure if you're spending time by yourself reading a book. But on a given day in that period of time, it was a day I felt like I couldn't even make anything happen. It was just really boring. And on my way back from the bathroom to my bedroom, there was a box sitting there with all these novels in it. And I stuck my hand in the box, pulled out a book, and the name of the book was Exodus by Leon Uris. And I looked at the book, didn't have any idea about the book. And so I took it into my room and I thought, all I've got to do is kill a half an hour. There's got to be something on TV better than reading, even a cooking program would do. And it's like within the first pages of reading, starting to read this book, it was a strange sensation. It was almost like I was being thrown into a story. And within the first pages of the book, it describes a very old, broken down ship in the Mediterranean Ocean trying to break a British blockade. And the book is filled with Jewish children who are orphans, and they're orphans as a result of the Holocaust. And all of a sudden, within the first part of the book, I'm thinking to myself, I didn't know there was a British Empire. I knew there was an England, only because of the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin and everything else. But it was the idea of a Jew. I'd heard the term before for sure, but it wasn't a part of my sphere. It wasn't like I really knew anything about Jews. But the idea of the Holocaust, I knew there was a World War II, but I didn't know anything about the Holocaust.
For people who, just as an aside, for people who do read and love books, this is what authors refer to as foreshadowing. Okay, you're telling us something that happened to you in 1976, and it really has a huge impact on what you've been doing with your life since then.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so that being said, so you realized there was an Israel and it compelled you to come here?
In short, for sure. Like going through the book was like walking through an emotional roller coaster ride. And in a way, coming to the point historically within the novel where Israel's declaring itself as a nation, with the backdrop of all the pressures of that decision. And it's like, I honestly felt somehow attached to that decision, which I couldn't explain. I couldn't understand what was going on inside of me. I hadn't realized I had an inside until that point. And then all of a sudden, the War of Independence is created as a result of that declaration of Israel becoming a nation. And I'm completely wrapped in the pages within the story. Are they going to survive? And when they survived the War of Independence, I took a moment, which I hadn't done because it had been days of almost like a marathon read where I couldn't hardly put the book down. I closed the book for a moment and I thought to myself, if there's a God up there, and I'm beginning to believe there is, he's got something to do with these Jews and somehow with this land that they seem driven to get to and driven to survive in. And it's like, at that point, I carried on. I read the end of the book. I ended up going to a library because I felt like I had to check out the historical facts that were put within this story, within this novel, to see if it was for real. and discovered I ended up going through a number of books looking at the Holocaust and the beginning of Israel as a nation until finally I made the decision that that was it. I'd read like way enough. I was going to go, but I didn't know how. So I started to work through, I discovered there was a Jewish community. I started to talk to an Israeli shaliach. He suggested to me, even though I'm a non-Jew, that I could go to Israel if I was planning. The plan was to be there for 6 months and work on a kibbutz. And he said, if you're going to be on the kibbutz for 6 months, you could do an ulpan. You could learn a little bit of Hebrew while you're there. And I figured I'd backpack through Europe on the way back to Canada and take like a year.
That was kind of my plan also in 1991. So
oh, really?
It's a great plan. I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people did it, but
yeah, there is a verse in the Bible about man's plans and how God somehow, disregards them and sort of creates his own within their stuff. And so
you came to which kibbutz did you go to?
I went to kibbutz Ramat Kovesh. Do you know where it is? It's beside Kfar Sava.
Okay.
Okay, so it's more in the central part, but the kibbutz was founded by a garin of like a Jewish youth movement out of Poland in 1932. And the fathers of the kibbutz, like the founding fathers, were the grandmothers and grandfathers when I got to the kibbutz in 77. And they were the ones that became my closest friends because they would invite me. They would invite me over, and it's like they realized just how much I was drawn to the history just previous before Israel becoming a nation, and the idea of looking at the place of how in the world, the question, how in the world did they survive?
That's a non-religious kibbutz, correct? That's not a religious kibbutz.
Totally secular kibbutz. But that's where I thought I would be for 6 months. I ended up being there for 7 years. Miraculously, that's a whole story in itself. I was given permanent residency. Nobody could believe it. Nobody could understand how I got it. I knew it was God for sure. And it was like, because he had put such a stamp on it that I was to stay in the land that I was given as this non-Jew permanent residency, I decided I had to do the one thing that I saw as an identification to the land, even as a non-Jew, was to do the army. And so I did my time in the army. I was in a little paratrooping unit. It was called Shaked. Just in time for the war in Lebanon in the beginning of 1981. I was Sadir then during that time. And the unit that I was with was basically there from the get-go and everything. And so after I finished my time in the army, then I was given full citizenship.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was not what I expected. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. It wasn't anything I expected either. It was incredibly, but the one point I wanted to make, when you introduced to me in the beginning as a Christian living in the land, I determined I came to Israel as a total non-believer searching for God, convinced that he had something to do with the Jews and with Israel, the land. That was the thing that drew me. But when I discovered the person of Jesus, basically, within the process of coming. Somebody had given me a New Testament. Again, it was like people thought I was going to get killed. They thought it was people in my family and my close friends in Toronto had told me that you've done so many stupid things to this point in your life, but this is the epitome of all. Why? Why would you go? Why would you go to the most dangerous place in the world? the boleg ishtacher, the final bolt has separated itself from the.
It is a little bit counterintuitive to think that a non-Jew would come to Israel, put his life on the line, and that would make him a better Christian.
No, but see, that's the whole issue. See, for me, all the people that I was talking to, we were all good pagans, good Canadian pagans, all right? Okay. We all had our own version of things. But they were looking at it strictly from a point of view of life and death and stupidity, according to their, gauging of what is stupidity. But it's like, I determined the moment I came into a relationship with Jesus in Israel, that's a whole story too. But it was like, I determined I would never call myself a Christian, ever.
Oh, that's amazing.
Because the word itself has so much baggage attached to it. And it's like I began to realize that my closest friends who were Holocaust survivors on the kibbutz, or the firstborn of a family that had sent them to Israel previous to the war beginning in Poland, but had lost all their family as a result of the Holocaust, I began to realize I would never, because they would always question me, what was it that drew you then, as this non-Jew, to come to Israel? They would, over cake and coffee, they would explain their history to me, and I was fascinated with it. The determination to get to a land that would be the only place of protection for them, with the backdrop of the Holocaust, became the stamp for sure to prove that way of thinking. But then they would say to me, after a lot of questions, a lot of talkings with them, what was it that brought you? And at that stage, I could say to them, I really believe that this has to be God. How did you survive the Holocaust and then survive Israel becoming a nation within the War of Independence? Because the odds were completely against this. This had to be something of God, at least from what I would see. But
to put it into context, if I can, to put it into context, you made Aliyah in 1977, which was literally less than 30 years after Israel became a state.
Right,
it was
28 years.
It was, 10 years after the 67 war, when we weren't even sure we would come out of it alive.
Right.
So Israel was really not so long after its formative years when you showed up.
Right.
So you attached yourself to Israel at a time when it wasn't so easy. In 77, it was a few years after the Yom Kippur War, which was pretty disastrous.
Right.
So you came to Israel and you really saw a little bit of the formation. You were part of the formation of Israel.
Well, the interesting thing for me, sitting where I'm sitting now, fast forwarding at about 45 years, going back when I visit my parents on the kibbutz, I have a family that a part of the Opan adopted me, and I'm like the oldest son in the family for sure now. And we've gone through everything together. The war in Lebanon, me staying there, we're really tight. And all my main memory base is the kibbutz. I know everybody there. And it's like, but when I started on the Opan, on the kibbutz, it was still, the children slept in kids' houses. It was just the beginning of, there was one program on TV, the television program started at 8 o'clock at night, and it was only talk shows. The only programs, the main programs was like Starsky and Hutch and Dallas, right?
Yeah, it's so easy to get nostalgic about Israel back in the day when and I remember even hitchhiking was the way most people got around because no one had a car. No one had a license.
Nobody had a car. And it was like, Yeah, that's the way everything happened. And
So
honestly, I'm amazed that I've had the possibility of that kind of a transition.
right. So you watched the country grow up from its adolescence to its adulthood. Also, I also did the army much less time than you did actually. I did what's called Shlav Bet.
Okay.
But I was a hippie in America. I never would have done the army in America. I love America, but I'm just not an army guy.
Right.
But doing the army, putting on a uniform and actually carrying a gun when you don't want to, that really solidifies the relationship in a way that nothing else can, I think.
Well, it's in a way, everything that I've done that I feel like from the time of the cab driver in Vancouver is you feel something on the inside, there's something going on, and you're trying to respond to that, whatever it is, until a definition begins to happen. You define this as God in your life, but it becomes for me a relationship, not a labeling, not a religious label. That's why I decided in the very beginning, because with my friends on the kibbutz, they would, and we were really close. And I would say to them, I'm not, because I would bring it in, they'd say, okay, what brought you? And I would say, I would start to relate to them God, right? At least my understanding at that point. And I'm a total non-religious personality. So it's like I'm relating to them from a point of relationship experientially, say, as much as I could define that, say, then. But the moment that I started to relate to them, the person of Jesus, the discovery, say, for me, and I'm so naive and so I don't know anything, right? And I'm explaining it to an older couple that's come, their whole background has been Poland. They've lost the majority of everyone they ever knew as a result of the Holocaust. And the moment you would say the word Jesus in front of them, it was like a bad smell came into the room. And it was like, I didn't understand, because again, I don't understand anything. I don't understand the conflict. But they started to relate to me church history and the persecution. And for them, the idea of the Nazi swastika represented much less a negative symbol than the Christian cross ever did.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. It was made very clear, because they're saying 2,000 years of church persecution created the foundation for the Nazi. The heart of Reformed Christianity out of Germany, Martin Luther, all of this other stuff. And for most Jews that I knew on the kibbutz as secular Jews, they would say, okay, Christianity is divided into two parts. You have the Catholic side, which has always had a history of anti-Semitism. But then you've got the Protestant side that had this sort of relational hope in the beginning, maybe, but then totally got thrown to the wind when the Nazis used Martin Luther's papers without changing any words in it at all concerning the Jews and their lives as Nazi propaganda. So it created within their mind, Christianity has been the biggest persecutor of who we are as European Jews, say, within our history. So
you're opening up an issue which is actually huge and painful, which, to be perfectly honest, I'm not quite willing to address at this point.
Okay.
Which is, but
that's
it's certainly
where the interview might get edited for sure. But
it's the big ugly elephant in the room, which is what was the connection between Christianity and Nazism?
Right.
And I mean, it's painful because I've been very blessed to connect with so many lovely, lovely Christians, but
Right.
it is the big ugly elephant in the room.
Well, see, it's the wordage, though. See, what I'm talking about for me personally, I don't like being introduced as a Christian living in the land. But when I was in the army, okay, this is where everything got defined for me. When I was in the unit that I was in, we were thrown into so many different exercises in the beginning. It's not like you got to know people through conversation. You got to know them through how they responded within certain situations that we're all put in. And you formed your friendships a lot of times depending on how much you trusted the person to be able to do what he's supposed to do within a given situation, say. Amazing. But what would happen is in a long guard duty, and they would, my Hebrew was like in the army, it was okay. But, after 3 words, they'd hear my Canadian accent and they'd start to ask me more personal questions. And they only assumed that I was a Jew that had done Aliyah to Israel. Most of them in my unit had never met a Gentile before. And when we started to discuss what drew me there, and I started to relate to them my search for God and all of these things, and the connectedness of the person of Jesus in my life, I always defined myself as a believer in Jesus, but never as a Christian.
That's because I know a lot of people like that, and they're usually the people who take the unusual path and ask the difficult questions.
Well, see, it's like the whole issue of dealing with. Again, it's almost like I feel like almost like my whole life primarily has been a result of responses. I feel like I feel things from God, from the Lord, and then I respond to that without knowing. It's not like, I've got an agenda, I have a plan. If I do this, the results could be this or that, and then I'll move from that point. Anybody that knows me knows that I'm useless as far as plans and strategies and all kinds of stuff. But it was funny in the very beginning of my time in Israel on the kibbutz, I determined that I was willing to argue over their misunderstanding of the person of Jesus, but I wouldn't argue with them on their understanding of church history. And so it had to... Yeah.
Rick, I hate to cut you short. I really do. Because, I mean, one day you and I are going to actually sit down and have a very long, meandering conversation. I have a feeling it'll happen in Arad.
Sorry.
My question, this is so important. You have no idea. So because a meeting between Christians and Jews is something that you have lived. Yeah. And that's a wisdom that really is needed in the world right now. But
we can't deal with that wisdom right now.
What I want to know is the artist. When you were in Toronto driving a cab, did you do artwork, or did that start in Israel?
I started drawing and painting ever since I was a little kid, and it was always a source of getting a lot of really positive attention. And, because my drawings, I could draw and I could do certain things and I would show it to my parents. My parents were very affirming. They were great. And it was like when I entered into my teenage period of time where it's more drinking drugs and, drugs, sex, and rock and roll was like the whole agenda for the 60s and 70s. But it was like always for me, the place of painting, drawing would come back after I had been like on a big binge for days, say. And you're in sort of a melancholy state and you're trying to examine all the damage that you've created as a result of the last couple days, say, and trying to bring it into some kind of order if it was possible. But I would always go into paintings when I was in the thing, and it was like I would lose myself within the painting. But it was strange. Even in those days, I realized that this is an inner communication. This is something going on in the inside that you're trying to give expression to on the outside. But I realized I don't, it's a language, but I don't have anything to say. There's nothing inside of me that's worth saying. It was nice getting attention and everybody saying, oh, what a gift you have, and all of this stuff. But there was a deeper place that you only examine when you're by yourself and when you're only, in a sense, desperate.
Did moving to Israel help you with that?
Moving on the kibbutz, so much stuff began to happen that for me, the biggest thing that happened was coming back from the fields, working on the kibbutz, heading back to my room. I picked up a piece of wood. It looked like a little piece of wood, looked like driftwood almost, but it was just thrown off to the side in the parking lot. Picked it up, took it back to her room. And when you're a bachelor on the kibbutz and you've got a lot of spare time, which is great. And I had a knife and I just started to carve. And there was something in the interaction with the tool and the material that somehow intrigued me. And I decided what they would do is every once in a while, they had a big avocado plantation on the kibbutz. And once the trees got too big, they would cut them down and do grafting, right? But it would leave these large pieces of the tree itself laying beside where they did the grafting. We worked in the bananas. I go over there one time with my tractor. I see this trunk of a tree that splits in two parts, two limbs going out. I thought, oh, I really like that shape. I grabbed it, loaded it onto the tractor, carried it back to my room. The carpenter on the kibbutz got me an old wooden mallet and some old wood chisels and stuff. And I started to, I put it on a chair. It was about 3 feet high and it would split into two limbs, but the chair could support it. I put it on the chair and I would see things in it, a hand or a face or something that looked, and I would try and pull it out more, express what I think I'm seeing. And then I would always, in a sense, I would think I see something in it, and different things, as you develop it, other things you begin to see. And all you're doing is just trying to pull out what you think you see. There was no plan. There was no, what I'm going to make the wood be. And it was always interesting because after a whole days of work, you'd come in and your biggest decision on the kibbutz after work is just like what you said, it's your shower time now. And so it's after work. But then I'd glance at this half-carved piece of wood, and I'd see something. And I'm thinking, I'm just going to take a minute, pull that out, and define it just a little bit more. And all of a sudden, 5 hours have gone by. It's now midnight or whatever. It's really late. There's wood chips everywhere, all over the room. And it's like, I'm thinking... At this point, praise God, I'm not married, and so all I had to do was just move the chips out of the way and I'd go to sleep, because we'd have to get up at 5 the next morning. And it was like, this was a constant until at one point I come back and there's multiple very surreal looking carvings within this wood. And I started to look at it, and all of a sudden I look at it and I go, this is Jesus healing the blind man. There were all these very surreal, interwoven,
do you think Israel
carvings.
Opened you up?
Oh, absolutely. As a sculptor, absolutely. The kibbutz, where, in a way, and I'm not taking a religious expression, but it was like, honestly, for me, from so many points of view, the kibbutz was like a born again experience for me from almost every angle of my life, because the communication within sculpting started on the kibbutz. It developed. I started to get tools. I started to learn things. I started to gather technical information from wherever I could find it. And I would end up doing carvings on the kibbutz and then giving them to the families who were the closest to me on the kibbutz as gifts and stuff like that. But it was like, I always described it as a prayer. It's almost like the prayer has something to do with what's going on inside of you, and you're trying to give it an expression in words. But for me, it was a three-dimensional expression. And so this more and more, it became much more a part of my life. Until finally, in the end, the sculpting part of it was the reason we had to leave the kibbutz. After 7 years of being on the kibbutz, I did my time in the army. I started to sculpt. I met Daphne during the time that I was, I'd known the family for a long time, but during the time primarily when I was in Lebanon. And and she came back to the kibbutz. We were married and, fully intending on staying on the kibbutz. But I kept feeling strongly that the art was to be something full-time. And on the kibbutz, I couldn't do it full-time. I loved being on the kibbutz. But in order to respond to the sense of working full-time as an artist, it demanded that we would have to leave the kibbutz. So that was the beginning of just about everything for me in the country, for sure, was the kibbutz.
So I want to jump forward to...
Okay.
You have two pieces of art that I'd like to focus on in chronological order. Tell me about the Fountain of Tears.
Well, see, everything that I've spoken about now became like my whole mode of working in the arts. If I felt that somehow my attention was being drawn, say, to a particular subject, and wherever the attention or that interaction would happen, then I would start to go into a creative process. And in 2000, we had left the kibbutz. I had started working full-time as an artist. I was learning how to work in different materials, in stone and in bronze. Primarily, bronze became the primary material. And it was years of doing a lot of smaller pieces of sculpture that we sold and that we basically survived miraculously, for sure, as an artist selling work and doing shows for, you're talking maybe 10, 15 years or longer. But in 2001, I had this interaction in 2001. It's also a long story, but I won't get into it. But it was a very strong interaction where I kept feeling the word inside of me, payback, which was a strange combination of words. And then there was certain circumstances that started to apply themselves to the Holocaust. And I felt like, in a sense, there was this inner pulling inside of me in the beginning of 2001 that somehow God wanted me to do something touching the Holocaust. And it had something to do with payback. And that somehow he was going to touch the number 6 million, which for the Jewish people is a number that represents death, but somehow he was going to take that number and turn it into a number that represented life. All of this interaction, all of these different things that were going on with me in that period of time, I had a really difficult time understanding. I had a difficult time trying to figure out how to respond to this. And in a way, I tried for almost a year to push everything that I was feeling away because I had already gotten used to the pattern of, if I felt something was my attention was being drawn to something, and if I'm relating to God from a relational point of view, and I'm feeling like he has this interaction in my life, I want to be able to respond. And what was always the response in my life was the beginning of a creative process. It was the beginning of stepping into something that I didn't know where it would lead to necessarily in the end, but I at least had a beginning step or a push thing. But the idea of touching the Holocaust for me, I kept on saying to the Lord, the Holocaust is a place of darkness, only filled with questions. How in the world do I touch this? How do I touch, especially as a non-Jew that has, I went through a whole year of arguing response and the idea of the Holocaust, but then all of a sudden, within the year 2001, I was invited to a conference in the United States, and one of the guys that was a part of the conference, he was a poet, he was a writer, and he was a poet, and a friend of mine who plays a violin, she's doing this whole thing, and at this conference, he was reciting a poem that he had written called The 7 Last Words. And I asked him in the beginning, what do you mean, 7 last words? And he said, when Jesus was crucified, he spoke 7 last utterances as he was dying within the crucifixion. I'd been a believer in Jesus at that point for many, many years, all right? But I couldn't think 7. Okay, I knew he said some things, but I wasn't sure. I couldn't recite, say, 7 words. So obviously I'm listening to the poem that was being recited by the poet himself with violin in the background. It was an incredible moment. But it was taken from the point of view of John the Apostle, the only one of Jesus's disciples that stayed with him during his dying, his being tortured to death. He was the only one out of the 12, was John, that stayed and watched the crucifixion, watching his closest friend and his Lord be crucified in front of him, right? And the poem is taken from that point of view, John's response to hearing these words. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. Today you'll be with me in paradise. Mother, this is your son. The fourth word is, my God, why have you forsaken me? I thirst. It is finished. And then the final word is, into your hands I commend my spirit. And this was a poem that was woven relationally connecting John's response to these words. It was like over an hour long. And I sat there and listened. I got so much visual stuff in hearing this poem. I was like overwhelmed. And I immediately went back. I started to do sketches, trying to figure out, I wanted a very Jewish looking John standing in front of this crucifixion. I'm trying to figure out how to do the crucifixion as one, but divided into 7 parts, because each part would have to then represent one of these 7 last words. And I'm like, how do I divide it and at the same time keep it together, right? This is 2 weeks of sketching all in the middle of the night, and I'm trying to work through, and I'm listening to the cassette of the recording of what they had done that night. Oh, I don't know how many, 100 times. And I'm listening and I'm listening. All of a sudden, in the middle of this frenzy of sketches, and this payback word, I had pushed it aside for 5-6 months, and I felt like it hadn't been revisited, say. And then it's like all of a sudden in the middle of the night doing these sketches on these crucifixion panels, right? And I had done a dividers of pillars of stone between the 7 panels. All of a sudden, I felt inside a question, right? And for me, it's like, this is like, I feel like the Lord is speaking something to me. And I feel like he's saying to me, what do pillars of stone on top of each other represent? And in a way, to be really honest, I'm like, Lord, this is like, I'm sketching now. I don't want to think, I'm sketching. And it's like, all of a sudden, I felt again inside, I felt like he asked me, he says, count how many pillars you've done. How many pillars have you done to divide these 7 panels? And I count the pillars, there were 6 pillars of stone. And all of a sudden, I realized you're trying to connect the Holocaust and the crucifixion of Jesus into like a memorial. Because I said to him, pillars of stone piled up on top of each other. When Israel came into the land and they crossed the Jordan, they took the stones and they made a memorial to that moment. The moment memorial came into my mind was just like, I got incredibly overcome emotionally, to put it really light, totally lost it. But it was a mix of tears, but it was a mix of wow, but it was a mix of fear and also a little bit of anger, because my whole thing was, Lord, how in the world do you connect the crucifixion and the Holocaust together? It's insane. It's insane. I've been living long enough in Israel.
So Rick, if I can, I'd like to do something that interviewers shouldn't do, which is interrupt you with my own personal reaction.
Okay.
I have not yet gone down to see. There are 2 installations, which I'll ask you about in a bit, one in Arad and another one in Auschwitz, of this amazing piece of artwork. When I first saw it, I reacted very strongly as a Jew. You did something that on the face of it is totally forbidden and kind of a bit horrifying, which is to apply Christian belief to the Holocaust. And I mean, the word Holocaust itself means the holy burning. And on one level, and on a level I think that's unapproachable to the average person, is to apply Christian belief, the death of Jesus, to the Holocaust, the death of the Jews, which is pretty difficult because, you're not saying, you were saying like Jesus was there for us Christians, or for us believers, but it was, the Jews were the victims. And Jesus was a Jew.
No, you see, always my argument with Israelis, because we get lots of groups, right? And many times Israelis have said to us, you've taken the 2 hardest things in our history and you've put them at the same table. This is insane. What you've done is totally insane. I've done many, many times, right? But there's been also many times that people who would be more leaning towards intellectual, trying to explain everything, or religious intellectualism, say, and they will say, you've taken Christianity and you're trying to connect it to Judaism or the Holocaust and Christianity. And I'm going, no. It's not. It's all relational. If I'm trying, in a sense, I'm responding not to Christianity, I'm responding to the person of Jesus, right? And I'm relating to him, which I've said to all the Israelis that have shown up here that have seen this. I understand. I totally understand the place of being horrified and like shocked and all this stuff, right? I do. I totally get it. But this is not a religious dialogue. This is a dialogue of relationship. If Jesus and Mary and Joseph and all of his disciples were all around during the 30s, they, as Jews, would have been put on train cars sent to Auschwitz.
Right. If anything, I see it as a challenge. I see it as a challenge to the Christian belief in Jesus, saying, where was your belief in Jesus? If Jesus was on the cross and you had been there, you should have spoken up. He was a Jew on the cross. Now the Jews were being loaded into cattle cars. Right. Where was your belief in Jesus then?
His brothers, his Jewish brothers and his Jewish sisters were all being loaded onto train cars, and you decided to remain silent. Either for convenience, self-protection, there's lots of great justification for saving your life and your family's life and everything else. But the idea of this is a relational definition, not a religious definition. You as a person, you relating, I as the artist, I can only relate to the person of Jesus from a relational point of view, not from a Christian religious movement, religious understanding. I'm relating purely relationally. That's what he has meant to me my entire life in Israel. And so it's always, when I create, I'm creating out of a response to what I'm feeling on the inside, which is the majority of Christianity already shuts the door on me. And which, in a way, they think all artists are astronauts, all mystics or astronauts anyway. But if I say to a group of, say, more conservative Christians that I felt like the Lord said this to me and I responded to what I felt like was being said, you're written off right away because of their theology, say, or because of the way they think. Mm-hmm. But I look at it and I think to me.
So you have one installation of the Fountain of Tears in Arad where you live, which I highly recommend going to see. I should forewarn people that Arad is, even by Israeli standards, in the middle of nowhere. Very isolated in the middle of a desert.
Spoken by a man from the Golan.
Right. I mean, the Golan is in the middle of nowhere, but at least we have, trees around us. But Arad is really in the middle of nowhere. I highly recommend it. And you have another installation of the Fountain of Tears. I should also mention the Fountain of Tears, of course, was a verse from Jeremiah, which in the Hebrew, in the Jewish version of the Bible, appears chapter 8, verse 12, which in the non-Jewish version of the Bible appears in chapter 9, verse 1. And the verse reads, "Oh, that my head were water." And when I saw the images and I read the verse and I put the two together, it was a powerful experience in itself. The verse is, "Oh, that my head were water, my eyes a fountain of tears. Then would I weep day and night for the slain of my poor people." Right. And if that isn't about the Holocaust, that is my new Holocaust go-to verse. That's it.
That is totally.
So who commissioned? I'm just curious. Who commissioned the piece? First of all, who commissioned the first piece, and how did it get to Auschwitz?
Nobody.
Nobody.
Nobody. See, I look at it, and it, like, if I'm being like honest and completely undressed and everything else, it's like I have to honestly say this was something that the Lord initiated. I responded to it. There was no body of people or organization or anything behind it. I always make it's sort of it's not a joke, but it's the circumstances that happened. We were living on a little settlement in northern Samaria, all right? For 12 years, we lived on this settlement. And it came to 2005, Ariel Sharon becomes the prime minister, and the idea of Pinui, the idea of redeployment, is all through the air, right? But it's all concerning the settlements down in Gaza, in Gush Katif and everything. all down in Gaza. But somewhere within the negotiating, 4 settlements in northern Samaria got included into the deal. And we were one of those 4 settlements. And so,
Oh, really?
yeah, so because of the redeployment, how did the redeployment, from a practical point of view, you have a government official come in and assess how much what your net worth is, say, and how many years have you been there, how big is your house, and they come up with a number that they're going to now pay you off in order to leave, and all this stuff. But because I was also a sculptor, and in the little tiny Ezot Tasiyad, like the
industrial center,
industrial part of the settlement, which was tiny, I had my studio there. So we were given financial compensation because of our house, how many years we'd been there, but plus because of the studio. But the deal was the government would give you 75% of that amount of money, and then you would go find another address anywhere in the country, and you would use that money. We determined, Daphne and I, and the 2 boys, Daniel was in the army then, and it was like we couldn't trust that we'd get the 25% because there was so much confusion and so much stuff going on. We decided that we would have to buy a house using the 75%. But my prayer was, because we were in the middle of doing the elements for the Fountain of Tears in my studio, which I didn't have a lot of room there, but they were everywhere. All the figures representing the Holocaust, they'd just been cast. I was just starting to finish them. The idea of the wall in Jerusalem stone was the idea, but that wasn't even started yet. But we're dealing with redeployment and all the pressure of that. So we end up going through, again, a whole long thing. The one word we kept feeling was a voice crying in the wilderness. And through a lot of funny circumstances, really strange circumstances, we ended up talking to a friend that lived in Arad. She shows us a house that's for sale here in Arad, and it has this courtyard in it that would be the perfect size for being able to actually do the entire wall, which I hadn't had till then. But the money aspect was, we had paid for everything. I'm a working artist. We'd had lots of commissions. We had spare money. I could work for a year on doing the modeling, getting everything ready with the figures. So nobody's commissioning this other than what I felt God was commissioning this. And so I'm responding, but I'm not asking for anybody to pay money on it, because for me, money's a confirmation. If I get money that comes in to be able to do this for sure is really God. And so I'm not asking anybody. And it's like we get down to Arad, and now the big amount of money that had to go out to pay for the casting and the bronze, that's the expensive part of the whole process, right? Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, we show the government that we do have a house here in Arad now, and the 25% that would come in all of a sudden does come in one big thing. And in a way, the government of Israel ended up paying for all the casting and everything, for the whole thing. And it's like, so and it was the same story. There were people that gave money to the building being created in Auschwitz, but not because I was asking them. They heard about it. It was people that had been to the fountain here, heard that we were thinking about Poland, and started to then send money to help do the thing. But it was never the initiating part, again, was just trying to respond to what I was feeling, and the other things came after. The support mechanisms and stuff like that.
It's an amazing visual, so I can understand why people would go into it and want to support it. And you've also recently done another piece that was placed in Auschwitz, The Lion of Judah. which is also, I mean, you definitely have that knack of 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 the visual giving over a message that transcends words, which is not easy for a writer to say. But
Wow,
it
that's a major confession.
it grabs you, and the response is visceral. It's a message that's too big for words. So the vision, the image. Could you describe what the image looks like and physically, and what it means for you? And also, I should add that it was the installation of the Lion of Judah was placed in Auschwitz on International Holocaust Remembrance Day last week. So what did it look like? Last Friday. So what did it look like, and what did it represent for you?
Really good question. We don't call it the Lion of Judah. It represents the Lion of Judah for sure, but we call it the vengeance of the Lamb. And it's a lion that is fully vertical, not fully vertical. It's like it's standing on 12 stones, 12 very large stones that represent the 12 tribes of Israel. The lion is roaring upward. The head is very vertical, pointed upward, and there's a whole sense of drama within the roar of the lion. But between the two front legs that are attached to the base of the 12 stones, interwoven into the two front legs, laying on the top of the stone, is a lamb that's been slain. All right? The lion is roaring, but in the mane of the lion, there's a menorah that's interwoven into the hair of the mane, over the heart of the lion, over the chest of the lion. Because over the years, anytime I use a visual of the menorah, a lot of times I've done pieces with a relief of another lion that was also roaring visually, that represented the diaspora, or represented the Holocaust. It's another piece that's actually on the building. You'd see it in the background. I've got all kinds of pictures of it. But in that lion, in the hair and that lion, there's a menorah, but it's upside down. It's floating upside down. And for me, if the menorah is upright, standing the way it should stand, it's Israel back in the land. That's what it symbolizes to me, is the sense of the menorah, that it's now in its rightful place. And so it's vertical, and it's a part of the roar, the motivation of the roar of the lion. The lion and the lamb together, in my mind, has two representations. There's a relational connectedness to the person of Jesus himself, because in the New Testament, it represents him as the Lamb of God that takes upon the sin of the world himself within that act of sacrifice. And so he is the Lamb that is represented within this, but this would be what is always referred to as the first time that Jesus comes. I look at the lion in a place of roaring as the Lion of Judah is also a representation of who he is, but within his second coming, within the coming of a sense of the lion representing what was nailed over the head of Jesus in his crucifixion was the written words, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And in a sense, the lion visually represents, almost like in my mind, where I really push it, where it's the sense of the judgment of the nations. Because all the time of creating the lion, you're talking years until the moment happened, and the moment happens. And if I told you the whole story again, which I can't, the circumstances, timing-wise, for the lion to actually be placed in Auschwitz facing the camp, the entrance to the camp of Birkenau, on the 27th of January was circumstantially, like for me, completely, like it really shook me just to see how everything happened for it to all come together exactly on that date. And there's so many times in working on the lion, there's verses all through the Bible that where it talks about the roaring from Zion and God as a mighty lion roaring from the land. And there's always this reference in a sense of this visual of the lion, but it's also for me really strong in the last chapter of Joel. In Hebrew, there's 4 chapters. In English, there's only 3. But the 4th chapter in Hebrew, it talks about payback, tagmul. It talks about very strong reference to what was done to the Jewish people within the Holocaust and how the Lord was going to pay back what was taken from them, what was done to them. And there's a verse close to the end of that chapter where it talks about that the Lord would roar from Zion. And in a sense, all of these things come together as a relational visual, a communication within the placing of the lion, and specifically, you're talking the lion now marks the building where the Fountain of Tears is, but it's facing what the prisoners of Auschwitz-Birkenau, for really good reason, described these gates as the gates of hell. And in a sense, this is God himself roaring against the gates of hell, because his payback, his sense of vengeance, God's sense of vengeance, is the sense that where death has been manifest and so well architected, so well produced, specifically to the Jewish people, he's going to bring life. This is his vengeance. This is how God does vengeance. He doesn't bring more death and destruction. He brings life in a place where it was only intended as a place of death. And so for me, the lion has all of that within the conception. But see, for me as the artist, I live with a million points of memory attached to it. People that see a piece of sculpture finished, it's their impression of what they see because it's artwork. So it has a way of communicating in a lot of different ways to a lot of different people. But the idea of the process for me of creating the fountain, creating the lion, it's like a prayer. I feel like it's like an intercession touching something that is with you until you earth it. And at least my earthing is by placing a piece of sculpture or something that expresses what's going on the inside.
So, Rick, I have a rule when I do videos, especially the better, fascinating videos, that I always like to keep the people wanting more and asking questions. And sincerely, you have so much to say through not only through your artwork, but also through your words. I'm going to give the links to your website where people can actually see the fountain video of the Fountain of Tears. Also where they can connect with you and, God willing, support your work, which I'm totally in awe of. And hopefully they'll be able to connect you. If anyone comes to Israel, if you're in the south of Israel, I highly recommend connecting with Rick and his work in Arad. It's a trip, but it sounds like it'd be worth it. It's definitely worth it.
Take the chance, come down from the north, warm up a bit. You can warm up in the desert a bit.
My problem is trying to get a day off. I'm reporting I'm supposed to be reporting the redemption and the amazing people who are bringing the redemption to Israel, to the world. And I'm working time and a half overtime.
Wow,
it's just
good.
So much
That's
happening.
good. That sounds
Things are happening at such a fast pace. things like what you're doing. I'm so amazed at what you do. I mean, to give this message, which is especially poignant to Christians, I think is really important in our days. So, Rick, I'm going to be in touch with you again. Like, thank you so much for your time, and don't go away yet. I want to talk to you after after the recording. Thank you so much, people. If you want to get in touch, I'll put the links down below, and I highly recommend getting in touch with Rick.